Good morning. I'm very excited about our sermon series coming up, as you can tell. I hope you get excited about it too. And I was noticing yesterday as I was pondering it, different subjects, we got the next 3 or 4 sermons kind of planned out, that as I was thinking about this sermon, I noticed that the 4th sermon was getting in, the 3rd sermon, so it's hard to do that and to keep it straight. But I think the topic that we have been on to and will continue on is what does spiritual growth mean, and what does Unitarian Universalism mean, and how do we integrate spiritual growth and Unitarian Universalism? How does the history of Unitarian Universalism affect us in our spiritual growth and as individuals? And is it possible to kind of watch Unitarian Universalism history out here and like it and affirm it and say yes to it, but then if we watch it out here, then we don't step into it and participate with the history. And so we're also working on how do we participate and step into a historical line with intentionality to actualize the values that we believe in, rather than kind of stand out and not do that. And I thought I would give an example today in the beginning of this sermon, of how 2 worldviews collide and how you can participate in one worldview so much that you might not be able to really understand or appreciate somebody else's worldview. And so that would be a way of, in a way, we have to get out and look at it in order to step into it, so we're not captured by it, so that we are with intentionality and with intellect and with our hearts and spirit, we intentionally step into a heritage, a story, a history, rather than being captured by it. And this is an example of, I think, somebody captured by a worldview that they can't see another worldview, and it's important. How many of you know Patrick Buchanan? TV commentator guy, Nixon, Reagan, proclaimed libertarian, I suppose. He writes very honestly this article, and I'm surprised and glad of his position in a way, but the example of the worldviews colliding, it was just too good to let go. The article's called Tea Party versus War Party. First of all, for somebody to acknowledge that part of our political process has designated war party, I thought was pretty honest. This group of people are the war party people of our nation, is what he's saying. I thought that was pretty honest. And he's saying that the Tea Party and the war party that makes up the Republican Party, which wherever you stand, that's not the issue at this point, it's a worldview issue, that eventually they agree on deficit, getting rid of the deficit, right? They agree on that. But the war party of this Republican Party, they do not want to pull out of Iraq. They want permanent place in Iraq. They want permanent place in Afghanistan. And the Tea Party so much on deficit reduction, he's saying that eventually this is going to cause a split, because the Democrats aren't going to go along with the war party, but they will go along with some deficit reductions. Okay, and so he eventually says that the deficit's just way out of whack, and we've had hints 65 years ago. Eisenhower and different people warned us about being involved. George Washington warned us about being involved with other nations in terms of war. So I mean, it's not a new theme. And so he eventually says that we got a choice to make. We're either going to maintain our empire or we're not. And he's saying that in order to maintain our empire, we're going to stay in deficit position. And the only way to get out of this deficit position is the end of the empire, because Democrats are not going to go along with cutting the social safety net, because the social safety net is the primary reason that Democrats exist. So they're not going to completely cut that out. So they're going to get the war party, that part of the Republican war party and Democrats are never going to agree on anything. He said, but the Tea Party is so committed to the deficit reduction that the Tea Party and the Democratic Party might join up to pull the empire in. So here's Pat Buchanan saying this is what we need to do. And I'm going, hey, okay, right? But then he says this, and this is where the worldviews come in. Do you remember McGovern, 1968, run for president? And he was running in 1968 and was labeled the peace president. That's what he wanted, peace. Well, he did not win. And Buchanan says this about George McGovern, because George McGovern was bring them home from Vietnam, bring them home. Let's not have these foreign wars. So he's the peace guy. And so at the end, Buchanan finally says that Senator McGovern was right. We have to bring them home. And he says the only problem with McGovern is that he was 40 years too early, was his timing. Okay? That's a worldview. What Buchanan is saying, for the past 40 years, my view has been completely right, and McGovern is just catching up with us. Right? That's his point. I'm right, and finally we're joining up with McGovern. Rather than, McGovern was a prophet. He was right all along. If we would have done this in 1968, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in today, and all those soldiers, both sides, people, civilians, wouldn't have died in Vietnam from 1968 on, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. So here you have, and I'm reading this, and I'm going, no, we should have joined McGovern in 1968 and pulled the troops home and started to end the empire then and commit to domestic strength and that kind of. So here's two worldviews clashing. The same events, but two worldviews clashing. You have to be able to from this article, it seems like to me Buchanan didn't have the capacity just to step out and said, this is my worldview, this is McGovern's worldview, and here they are colliding. Maybe I was right, maybe I was wrong. Just a capacity to say, maybe I was right, or maybe I was wrong. The capacity to recognize that you do have a worldview, that you could be right and you could be wrong. I'm glad he's there. If you've read Nemesis, Chalmers' book, he gives examples of the Roman Empire and the English Empire, where the Roman Empire stayed invested in imperialism, and the Roman Empire ended, where the British Empire ended their imperialism, spent their money on domestic spending, and strengthened their country. We do have examples of this. So, I'm glad he's there, 40 years late, and that's my worldview. He should have been a little faster. When we talk about spiritual growth in today's world, some of the images that come to my mind is when I've been down to visit Key West, and we walk into this one shop, and it has all the glass-made dolphins and kind of the nice things, and it has the kind of the new age music, and it almost takes your mind and moves you to a different mood where your whole body just goes, and you kind of relax, and that gets labeled as spirituality, and when we let go of that tension, and somebody says you might say if you practice that kind of, that's spiritual growth, and that's what we're about spiritually in today's culture. So when we think about spiritual growth that way, that's a good thing, and I think we also need that. But then when we think about spiritual growth in terms of our own heritage as Unitarian Universalists, we think about social justice, and when we think about spiritual growth in terms of social justice, it's a little bit different than walking into a New Age shop. When we think about the life of Jesus in social justice, which he was for social justice, and talking about making sure everybody had food and everybody had water and clothing, and that was primary part of his teachings, but he ended up executed. So here's spiritual growth that leads you there. When we think of Gandhi and his spiritual growth, he ends up assassinated. We think of Martin Luther King and exercising his spiritual maturity. So spiritual growth can be problematic, to say the least. So, who would want spiritual growth that would lead us to isolation and that would lead us to be rejected. What is that about? And do I have the psychic capacity to mature my spiritual self in a culture that would reject? And as Unitarian Universalists, in a way, we kind of are rejected, called a cult. I mean, we've called many things, not even a church and such. So I thought I would kind of reset some principles of spiritual life as individuals and as a community as we begin this sermon series. One, so you know where I'm coming from. Two, so you can either agree or argue with me, or agree and say, and here's more stuff too that we need to consider as well. So those kind of things, and then we'll move on to Channing. When you look at an infant, and part of Channing's work, William Ellery Channing, one of the founders of Unitarianism in this country in the 1810, 1820, 30s, when you look at his work and what he teaches, he uses the word unfolding a lot. He says that our spirituality and who we are as beings unfolds, and ideally in a nice gradual pace and kind of way. And he doesn't really mention disruptions or anger or violence. He just says there's a nice, graceful unfolding process in our spirituality, and we move toward the sense of the infinite and to the light. When we look at how we deal with children in our culture and children developmentally, there's thinking that also goes along with that you take a child and you hold a child and you gradually introduce that child to the world. You gradually introduce that child to more and more and more of the world, so that the child in a way senses being cared for, senses being loved, and that as the child integrates the world, the larger world, more and more and more, the child's always in touch with the sense of being loved and cared for. The sense of being loved and cared for accompanies being introduced to the larger world, and that child's life will unfold and unfold and unfold in a very graceful way. And I would also say that that's the kind of experience that we need to be able to carry out the spiritual growth that was modeled by Jesus, Gandhi, and King. We need that in us, that sense of being cared for, that sense of being loved, that sense of being held. We need that in us to move to that spiritual maturity. And so as that happens with the child, that also needs to happen for us as a community. As a community, you need to be able to come here and have different thoughts and explore different thoughts and have different experiences and share your story and know that as you do that, you are cared for.